with Florida Conservation Commission. There we go. And I'm just here today to talk a little bit about the Florida Manatee and what we do at FWC with our rescue program. All right, so just some basics about manatees. They are part of the order Sirenia. There are two families that make up the manatee families. That's going to be family Trichechidae. That's comprised of three main species: the Amazonian manatee, West African manatee, and the West Indian manatee. Within the West Indian, we have our two subspecies, the Florida manatee, which we'll be talking about today, and the Antillean manatee. In our second family, we have Dugongidae, and those are made up of the dugongs, which you can see in the photo above, and the stellar sea cow, which are now extinct. All right, so just a little bit of history on manatees. They are in fact native to Florida. We actually know this because we have 45-million-year-old fossils of manatees that have been found in Florida. However, they became quite popular for hunting, for their meat, oil, and hides, and their numbers soon began to dwindle the more Florida was settled. So in 1893, it became illegal to hunt manatees in Florida. In the 1970s, it was estimated there were less than 1,000 individuals left in the wild, which prompted a series of protections to be stated for them, including the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, and Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act. In 2015 through 16, it was estimated that we now had around 8,800 individuals, which prompted the species to be downlisted from the endangered to threatened list in 2017. Manatees can get quite large. Typically, calves will range from about 4 to 6 feet in size. Juveniles will get between 6 to 9 feet, and adults will be somewhere between 9 and 12 feet. So those calves can get quite small at only about 60 pounds. So typically when we're asking people to assess manatees in the wild, we'll ask how many people you think could pick up this manatee. For a calf, it should really only take about 1 to 2 people to pick up. So it's always a good thing to keep in mind if someone asks, you know, the size of the manatee and whether or not you think one person could actually carry it. So while we do call them the Florida manatee, they actually have a larger range than you would expect. So you could see in the winter, they really like to stick just around Florida's coast here. They like to stay here for the warm water. In the summer, they'll start to expand, going out about to Mississippi, Louisiana, and working their way up to the Carolinas. And we do have those manatees that really like to travel. And every now and then we'll get manatees over in Texas and all the way up, even up till New York. We do have a manatee who's quite famous, nicknamed Chessie, and we call him that because he really loves to hang out in the Chesapeake Bay area in the summers. So they can definitely travel quite a bit. Now, I did mention that they like to stick around Florida in the winter. It's because they're really finicky about their water temperatures. They really don't like it to drop below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So you'll typically find that they like to congregate around those natural and man-made warm water sites here in Florida, such as the power plants. This photo here is of the FPL power plant and Manatee Lagoon over in Riviera Beach. And you can see just how many manatees there are in that area during the winter. So that's a really great time to be able to go out and see them and interact with them. So one of the most common calls we get are about manatees just sort of floating about, looking almost dead in the water. And this is just how they sleep. Manatees can sleep for up to 12 hours a day, and they do something that we call surface resting, which you can see in the photos here, or sometimes they'll like to bottom rest. And that basically just means that they will remain almost motionless, really only coming up for air and moving their noses. And they can do that anywhere between, every 5 minutes or so, or they can hold their breath up to 20 minutes. So we get a lot of calls about them being dead, but they really just like to hang out and soak up the sun and take a bit of a nap every now and then. All right, so the manatee section of Florida Fish and Wildlife is responsible for recovering carcasses, performing necropsies to determine cause of death, rescuing ill, injured, or orphaned manatees, transporting those rescued animals to rehabilitation facilities, and then eventually releasing them back into the wild after rehabilitation. We also monitor the manatee population through photo identification, aerial surveys, and attaching GPS tracking gear to the manatee individuals. So there are 5 coverage areas within Florida Fish and Wildlife. in this state, and the Southeast lab down here. That's where we are right now. We cover anywhere from Fort Pierce all the way down to Key West. So we have quite a large range, and we only have 2 full-time staff members, a part-time staff member, and usually only 1 to 2 interns. So it's quite a big area for us to cover, which can make it difficult to respond to everything we get a call about. But luckily, we do have a great team of volunteers that we can always send out to check on manatees that we think might be in distress while we're out responding somewhere else. So I'm mostly going to talk today about the main threats to the Florida manatee, the reason why they are considered a threatened species. We're going to talk about watercraft collisions, cold stress, entrapment, tidal strandings, entanglement, red tide, and unfortunately orphaned calves. So with watercraft collisions, we do see 2 different types of trauma. We see impact trauma, which is on that upper right corner, and the cut trauma on the bottom right corner. Impact trauma is caused by boat hull, lower end unit, or even propeller impact. This can typically break the ribs, which often damages the lungs, and that can affect the buoyancy of the manatee. In that upper right corner, that manatee is actually on its side, and from that mark, it doesn't look to be too deep or too serious, but that's actually the reason for this entire buoyancy issue. So these impact traumas can become quite serious. We also see the cut trauma. As you can see, that's coming from the sharp edges of a boat or when the motor is cutting onto the skin. This can cut pretty deep into the tissues and organs and even the bones, but manatees are super resilient, and for the most part, they can survive this trauma, and those healed wounds will eventually become white scars. So a bit more on those impact traumas. The wound appearance is typically pretty little to less obvious on the external damage, and it'll usually only consist of 1 or maybe a pattern of linear marks like you're seeing here. Nothing that you would suspect would be too serious from the outside, but it can really affect that buoyancy and cause a manatee to become positively buoyant or negatively buoyant. When they are positively buoyant, that just means that they're floating more than they should. So you might see their back exposed a bit more out of the water and have that dry back. And this can cause problems with them being able to submerge, or you'll see them really pop right back up to the surface like a balloon when they do go under the water. They can also become negatively buoyant, which is the opposite problem. Instead of floating too much, they're not really floating at all. And they'll typically stay near the bottom, and they really struggle to come up to the surface. They can also have a change in the angle at which they are oriented. So instead of having their back up like a typical manatee and being what we say even in the water, they might list to the side. So you'll see on this bottom photo, this animal is almost completely 90 degrees turned counterclockwise and has their right side high. That paddle is pretty much completely on its side. And that is another issue that can be caused by this type of trauma. With the cut trauma, obviously there's a lot of different things you're going to see here. There's going to be deep lacerations. There can be very superficial scrapes, and those deep lacerations can unfortunately expose organs or bones. A good way to tell whether or not they are fresh or healed. Those fresh cuts are going to appear red or pink. They might be bloody as well. Those healing lacerations are going to have more rounded margins, so you're not going to see as sharp of a cut. And those healed cuts will appear typically white, sometimes yellow as well. So cold stress, this really only occurs in the winter, and this happens when those manatees are in water that's just too cold for them. It typically only affects smaller manatees, so calves, juveniles, and small adults are really who we see getting affected mainly by cold stress. Some of the side effects, so to speak, would be lethargy, that whiteness on the face or the snout, or even the fluke. And other parts of the body. You'll see those visible abscesses on them, and sometimes they'll be emaciated as well. And when we reference a peanut head, that's a good sign to show whether or not a manatee is losing fat. They'll start to lose fat around their head, and they'll get sort of a peanut shape there. And it's always important to note whether the animal was away from a warm water site to account for why that animal might be enduring cold stress. So we also get manatees that like to get themselves stuck in different situations. They are incredibly curious animals. So pretty much anything they think that they can fit through, they're probably going to try and swim through it. Sometimes they'll get entrapped in an area where we had unusually high water as a result of king tides or hurricanes. And now an area that was once inaccessible to them, they can now swim over, and then they get trapped when those tides recede. Sometimes they'll swim through culverts or drainage pipes, like we see in the upper right corner, and they sort of just get themselves stuck in there, or they can get lost on their way out. And they can also end up in locks, dams, or other water control structures where we'll need to let them out in a bit more creative fashion. So whenever we get calls about entrapments, the first thing we're going to do is try and figure out how the manatee got to where it is, and see if we can trace that canal or culvert back to a main canal or an open water source to see if the manatee does have a point of exit. If they're stuck at a water control structure, we will coordinate with the operators of that structure to see, if it's a floodgate, maybe we can open it up, and that way they can swim on their own out of that area, or we can go in and we can catch and relocate that manatee. The good thing about entrapment is that it typically gives us enough time to plan for the rescue for this manatee, because we know they're going to be in that same spot. So unless there's a water temperature consideration, like if the water is too cold in that area, or there are other things going on in that area that could be life-threatening, it gives us enough time to coordinate and plan a rescue for that animal to relocate. We also get calls about manatees getting tidally stranded. This usually happens when a manatee is close to shore and the tide's just going out, and they get stuck either on the sand or the mud flats that are in that area. Firstly, we'll check to see when the next high tide is going to be. If the tide is rising and there's no additional concerns for that manatee, sometimes we'll just wait for the tide to rise and that manatee can swim on its own back out. Otherwise, we can intervene, and if the manatee is in otherwise good health, we'll just simply move it back into deeper water. So we do get a lot of calls about mating herds as well in regards to tidally stranded manatees. Mating herds are exactly as they sound. They are typically composed of several males that will come and go, and one main female that the males will mate with. And this can last anywhere from a couple hours to a few days or even a few weeks. It's typically a lot of activity going on. There's a lot of splashing and thrashing and rolling. And because of all the activity, the female will typically try and seek shallow water just to prevent from getting injured or drowning. And this typically causes the mating herd to obviously follow. And now you have a bunch of mating herds or a bunch of manatees that end up a bit too high up on the shore. So when this happens, people can get a little bit overexcited, sometimes a bit concerned about them, and they like to head out there and, there's a huge group of manatees. I understand it might be, exciting to go out there and to interact and to see them, but really the most important thing is to give them their space and leave them be. It can become stressful for them to be harassed. It can also become dangerous, not just for them, but for you as well. They are quite powerful. Manatees, so it's always good just to give them that space. And if you do see a mating herd, please give us a call just so that way we can assess the situation and make sure the female is okay and see whether or not the mating herd is getting stranded at all. So we do get a lot of entanglements, unfortunately, as well. The two main types of entanglements we see are from crab traps and monofilament fishing line. A crab trap is usually a single spherical float that will move with the manatee. So when the manatee is at the surface, it's at the surface with it, and when it submerges, so will the crab trap float. Now this can really affect their mobility. It can get wrapped around their flippers, it can drag along the substrate and affect their ability to come up for air. But a good thing to note is that crab traps are very spherical, and we do have tags that are similar to them, but they are more cylindrical. So this is an example of a satellite tracking tag. One area of research that we have involves the use of these tags to study manatee movements, habitat use, diving behavior, and response to human activities. So these are really important for us to use, and a lot of times they will actually get confused for crab traps and unfortunately removed. So just some things you can look out for if you see a tagged manatee in the wild or you're concerned there's a crab trap stuck on it. You'll see it's got this belt over here that goes around the peduncle of the manatee. The peduncle is just the space between the fluke or the tail and the main body of the manatee. And you'll see this nice long tether going up to this buoy. The buoys are typically painted in bright colors. They'll usually have words on them as well, saying, you know, FWC, if you see this tag, please call this number. And this antenna here, which is sort of the dead giveaway that it is a tracking tag and not a crab trap buoy. And you can get a better look at those here. And you can see how colorful it is and the antennas. So that's always a good thing to look for. And again, if you see a manatee out there with one or you're concerned, feel free to give us a call and we can always check and see if we have a tagged manatee in that location. We also have manatees that get entangled in monofilament fishing line. So this is that clear, thick fishing line that you'll see, and they'll often get themselves wrapped up in that or in cast nets. Sometimes they'll get wrapped around one or both of the flippers, and they can wrap multiple times. And you can see just how embedded it gets into the skin as well, really cutting through that tissue. And sometimes it can go all the way to the bone or through the bone as well. So it can get very, very deep. And usually you'll see a lot of scarring around the site of the entanglement or of a previous entanglement. And that's just scar tissue that's built up in that area. Unfortunately, monofilament can also be ingested for manatees. It's actually the most common foreign object found in manatee digestive tracts, and this can be fatal to them. It's going to mess with their digestive system and really prevent them from being able to digest the food that they need and to absorb the nutrients that they need. We do get some odd entanglements every now and then as well. So of course, the first thing we're going to do to assess the entanglement is decide what's making up the entanglement, whether or not it's life threatening, to see if there's anything dragging from it, to see if it's, you know, dragging up against the substrate or wrapped around the body. And we may even go in the water to assess that entanglement and potentially tag the manatee, so that way in the future when we're prepared for a rescue, we know exactly where it's going to be. So here's another photo of that life jacket around that manatee, and you can see it around the midsection of the body. And you could tell it's not embedded and it didn't pose any sort of life-threatening risk for this manatee. So what the rescue team did, they removed the manatee from the water, simply removed that life jacket from the manatee, and they were able to release it back into the wild on the same day. This is a lot more serious of an entanglement. This is actually a packing strap that's going around the body of the manatee. And you could really see how embedded it is in the flesh and see that scar tissue building up and how irritated the area is. So this is a manatee that would be coming in for rescue and not just getting their gear removed and then released back into the wild. So this is a great example of how important it is that when you do see entanglements, to give us a call and not attempt to remove it on your own. Removing an embedded entanglement like this can be dangerous for the animal, as well as yourself if the animal becomes spooked. So this way we can head out there and assess on our own and determine what the best course of action is for the animal. So I'm going to touch just a little bit on red tide. We really mainly see this on the west coast of Florida, but it does have some pretty severe effects on manatees. It can have a paralytic effect on them, which makes it difficult for them to swim, to move, to even move their head up out of the water to take a breath, which is why you see this rehabbed manatee in the upper right corner with this sort of flotation device, making it easier for this manatee to take a breath without having to try and work on it, because it really can't move from the red tide. Oftentimes they'll be seen thrashing around or corkscrewing. They'll have that trouble staying at the surface. And if the manatee recognizes this early on, some of them will actually move to shallow water and sometimes even beach themselves, just so that way they can take that air and they don't have to drown. And that really is the primary danger for manatees with red tide, is drowning. You can see one of our staff members on the bottom right, Blake. She's actually keeping this manatee's head above water until the rest of the rescue team arrives to get this animal out. We do get orphaned calves as well. So an orphaned calf would be a manatee that is less than 6 feet long with no obvious mother. Typically they'll be lethargic or emaciated because they're not eating, and they like to suckle off of large objects in the water, trying to find their mom, trying to find some form of food as well. So when we get calls about orphaned calves, we typically like to wait a little bit longer and see whether or not there actually is a mom in the area. Sometimes they will sort of park their calf and come back for them. So we like to wait and see. Other times calves that are orphaned will actually follow sometimes a male. So it's important that we wait to see and verify that the mom that we see swimming around is actually the mother of the calf. So again, making sure that manatee is less than 6 feet, seeing if they're nuzzling up to other large objects or suckling on them. And if they are small enough to be captured and rescued, then we will actually use a hoop net to rescue them, which I'll show you in the next slide. So we have 3 main techniques that we use to rescue a manatee. The first one is an open water-based net set. And those are going to be those 2 pictures in the middle right here. These show how we deploy the net from the boat, and this is how we would haul the manatee onto the back of the boat after capture within the open water Lancet net. The second technique we use is called a Lancet net. So again, using that same net, but instead of using a boat to deploy it, we'll simply send people out into the water and try and corral that manatee towards shore, and that's how we'll bring the manatee out of the water. The third technique we use is the hoop net, which you can see down here with this little cap inside. So we really only use these for calves or manatees that are small enough to fit into the hoop net. And really the technique that we choose is dependent on a couple factors, mostly the location, the accessibility of the area, and the manatee's own behavior and size. So this is our transport van on the right-hand side. Manatees are carried into this rescue truck using a stretcher, like this blue one here. And they'll be placed on thick foam pads to be comfortable. If the weather is cold, we'll use blankets to keep them warm during the transport. And in our rescue truck, we can actually fit up to 2 manatees at a time, depending on size. During transport, someone will remain with the animal in the back, like our staff member Amber back here, just to check on the animal and monitor its breathing rates and overall condition of the manatee in case anything changes while transporting to the rehab center. All right, release is always the most exciting part. Once cleared for release by rehabilitators, manatees will be released back, typically at the same location where they were rescued. Otherwise, if the rescue location was a part of the problem to begin with, then they'll be released to a more suitable location nearby. And we'll simply put them back onto that stretcher. We'll walk them back from the rescue truck into the water, and we'll let them swim off on their own. So this is a table showing the manatee mortality by county for all of 2020. You can see some of the things that we have spoken about already, like watercraft and cold stress as a cause of death. Gathering information on mortalities allows us to impact management strategies. So we can think, where are the manatees dying? Are they dying from watercraft, where in an area where we have speed zones? Are those speed zones effective? We can also assess the life history, so looking more at the general health and population status of the manatees, as well as characterize the internal anatomy to further research and understanding of the species. So how you can help. So it's always important when you're out on the water to obey those speed zones. Wear those polarized glasses. They really help you to see under the water surface, and that way you can keep an eye out for manatees or other sea life while you're boating. Just on the everyday, don't litter or throw any sort of fishing line into the water. Really try and help clean up debris as much as possible. Even something that gets thrown out inland can make its way all the way back into the ocean and really impact the sea life out there. And the most important thing is to keep manatees wild. So it is illegal to pet, feed, water, or harass manatees. These are designed to protect the manatee species. The last thing we want is for them to get comfortable around people. If they're being watered off of a boat, they might start to associate boats with water, and that can put them at risk for watercraft injury. So it's important just to let them sort of do their thing. I know they're very cute to look at, but the best thing is to take a photo and allow them to be wild manatees. So if you see an injured manatee, The most important thing is to take photos and videos. These are incredibly helpful for the staff here to assess the condition of the manatee. Typically, we'll ask you a series of questions as well, just to get a better idea on the behavior of this manatee, such as the breath rate, so how often it's taking a breath, whether or not there are any visible wounds or blood, and if so, the color and location of those wounds, what the activity is of the manatee, if it's sort of just hanging about and surface resting, or is it moving or swimming or submerging under the water. If it is even or listing, like the manatee photographed here, you can see is sort of on his side with his left side high, and if there are other manatees nearby. Other really important information for us to get is the exact location of the animal, a description of the surrounding area, and if we do decide to respond, to see whether or not you're able to stay with that animal until someone arrives, so we know it hasn't moved out of the location. We will also almost always ask what the size of the manatee is, and it's always better to overestimate. We use size as a determining factor as to what equipment we choose to bring with us. Some equipment is only suitable for a manatee up to 6 feet or 9 feet. So it's really important before we respond for us to get a good estimate on size. So again, asking yourself how many people you think could carry this manatee, or using something like a kayak or a boat as a size reference. It's also important not to get in the water with the animal or attempt a rescue on your own without someone there to respond or without the proper authorities. If you see a dead manatee, again, photos and videos are the absolute best thing. We'll typically ask descriptor questions like the skin color, the position of the flippers, whether it's belly up or back up, the amount of scavenging on the carcass, and its orientation. So is it grounded up on the beach? Is it in shallow water? Or is it free floating? We'll also need that other important information like location and description of the surrounding area, as well as that size estimate. All right, so thank you so much, everyone, for attending and listening into this World Lecture Series. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat now, or you can email me at my email up on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, Christina said thank you.
Thank you.
And then Nina said that she's new to Florida, so that this was very informative. Very cool. So again, I'm going to place this on YouTube so that everyone else who missed it can check it out. But thank you again for joining us and for doing this. It's super awesome.
Great. Thank you so much for having me and for everyone else popping in and listening in. So I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.